Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us this evening. Tonight we have a tech talk on React hooks by Garrett Seal. Garrett, whenever you're ready, please take it away.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for joining me tonight. And before I start, I would like to thank Seismic for sponsoring this tech talk. Tonight, I have the pleasure of talking about React hooks. And that brings us to the question, what are React hooks? So React hooks were added to React in version 16.8, and they allow for functional components to have access to state and other React features. It's cool that React allows us to have access state, but what does accessing state even mean? So state is a reflection of how the UI should look or behave based on the data it currently has. Adding state results in dynamic behavior and the ability to directly respond to the user's interactions or changes in data. So React is not the only library to use hooks or some form of reactive logic and stateful behavior, but I'll be focusing on React hooks for our talk this evening. And React hooks bridge the distinction between class and function components, which allows for a smoother and more modular method for building applications. In fact, building in hooks in mind keeps the code cleaner, easier to read, and simpler to grasp. So while I talk about the hooks and their benefits, that leads to a simple question. Just how many hooks are there? As of React version 18, we have access to multiple native hooks to cover as many use cases as possible. And on that note, React also allows and encourages creation of custom hooks to be used by developers themselves. In short, we have many hooks to choose from. So in order to help stay focused, I'm only going to focus on hooks that fall into specific categories, those categories being state hook, context hooks, ref hooks, effect hooks, performance hooks, and some others that have been added more recently. So for the first category, we have state hooks. And before state hooks, React would utilize class components to manage your state. However, the resulting code was more difficult to understand and reuse, especially for simple components. State hooks allow us to manage state without needing to use class components, which brings me to one of the most commonly used hooks in state called React useState. And useState declares a state variable that can be updated directly within a functional component. This hook is often used for simple components that require basic state management. An example would be an increment button, which directly updates the counter value once the button is clicked. And up next, we have the useReducer React hook. This React hook may remind some people of the Redux useReducer, and while they are similar, there are some differences. The Redux useReducer is a separate library which is geared towards managing global application state in large, complex applications, while React's useReducer is a built-in feature of React that is used for managing local state components and individual React components. But getting back to React's useReducer, this React hook is used similar to useState. UseReducer declares a state variable and manages state updates through a reducer function. This hook is useful for complex state transitions or when updates depend on the previous state. So UseReducer allows us to move the state logic outside of the event handlers into a single function of the component. So instead of keeping it all inside one button, like the useState, we can separate it, possibly in a switch statement to keep our code cleaner and still use that logic. So next up, we have context hooks. For context hooks, we have the conveniently named hook useContext. This hook is designed to read and subscribe to a context within a React component. This is useful when passing down global data or settings required by multiple components throughout an application. UseContext allows us to pass data through a component tree without having to pass props down manually at every level. If anyone here is a fan of dark mode on the browser, then this hook is for you. Because dark mode is a great example, the useContext hook toggles the dark mode option and subscribes the components to be updated. As a result, the subscribed components automatically re-render and reflect the newly selected theme. Moving on to the reference hooks, we have useRef. So useRef, unlike useState, can track and update a reference value across multiple renders without causing the re-render itself. So what this means is that after we define a value that we want referenced, that value will not result in any re-rendering, even if the value is updated. This hook's functionality could be utilized in caching expensive computations. Instead, the computation is only performed once, and the resulting value is used for reference moving forward. And by not recalculating after every re-render, we can save CPU time, memory, and processing power. A common use for useRef is to reference the DOM elements directly. By allowing for immediate access of DOM elements in the values, we can click the button and have the browser respond rather than a re-render of the entire page. So for the next ref hook we have is use imperative handle. This hook allows us to define a clear boundary between child and parent components. Doing this, we can expose specific functionality from the child to the parent component, promoting better encapsulation and the separation of concerns in our component's architecture. In this example, use imperative handle would be used to confirm information submitted on a form, and then the form's child components, such as name and email, can each have their own logic to verify the text entered is accurate. However, once we submit the form's use imperative handle can validate the child components. And if every child component on the form passed, it can be submitted. But if a field isn't filled out correctly, the form can focus on the specific child component and prompt the user to correct the input, which can decrease the amount of people that would just leave after it's not submitting and then just moving on with their life. Speaking of which, utilizing the use imperative hook promotes separation of concerns and encapsulation, as the form component is responsible for its own validation logic, but the parent form component determines whether or not the form is submitted at all. Now let's move on to the effect hooks. Starting off with everyone's favorite, the use effect hook. This hook is commonly used for connecting to external data sources such as APIs, databases, setting up event listeners, data fetching, subscribing, and other asynchronistic functions. Use effect usually is a go-to for interacting with side effects and functional components, but we also have access to two additional effect hooks for more specific use cases. One of those hooks is the use layout effect. This hook is similar to use effect, but it runs synchronously after all the DOM mutations. So use layout effect lets us specify logic we want to perform only at a specific time, such as updating the background only after the DOM has updated. However, this could negatively affect performance if the logic is too time-consuming, so it's preferred to use effect if possible. And our final effect hook is the use insertion effect. This hook fires before React makes any changes to the DOM. Now, use insertion effect is typically employed by libraries to insert dynamic CSS before React updates the DOM. So unless you're working in a CSS and JavaScript library and you need a specific place to inject the styles, you probably won't need to utilize this one. Instead, could use the use effect or use layout effect. Moving on to hooks that allow us to skip calculations and unnecessary rendering, we have performance hooks. The first being use memo. So use memo is a React hook that lets us cache the results of a calculation between re-renders. This hook should only be used for performance optimization, as it optimizes the calculation by caching the return values using memoization. All of that to say, if your code doesn't work without use memo, you need to fix the code and then consider coming back to use memo to make it optimized. And next we have the use callback. This hook is used to skip the re-rendering of function and components to improve the performance. An example would be if you have to run a complex calculation or fetch data every time a specific page is visited. Instead of recalculating or refetching that data on every re-render, you can just use the use callback hook to store the function and only execute when needed. Also note that use callback hook should use only for performance optimization, just as the last one. So moving on to hooks that prioritize rendering, we have use transition. Use transition wraps a state in order to make the transition non-blocking, allowing developers to define how the UI behaves during a transition. This could be used to add something like a loading indicator so that while the user is waiting, there's no, they know what's happening. It's loading at that moment, which also allows React to process other updates while that transition's happening, which appears to be a smoother transition for the user. As for use deferred value, this hook is used to make an application's performance appear to be improved by loading critical information right away and allowing less critical information to take longer. An example would be an app search feature. By using use deferred value, it could display a loading indicator while the application fetches the search results for each keystroke. But if the user backspaces, it can just display the previously typed results instead of fetching the result again. So hopefully you all now have a clear understanding of the functionality provided by React hooks and how they can enhance both the developer and user experience when implemented effectively. But so far I've only touched on some of the hooks we may encounter, and that's far from all of them. React is a well-maintained JavaScript library, and it continues to receive regular updates, which is aimed at improving its usability. So the hooks discussed so far have been made available since the release in React 16.8 through React 18. However, as of this year, 4 new React hooks have just been made available with React 19 beta. Those hooks are use optimistic, use form status, use form state, and simply use. So I'm now going to go over each of the hooks to give you an idea how we could use them, starting with use optimistic. So use optimistic is a React hook that lets us optimistically update the UI. This allows developers to show a different state while an async section is being performed. This state is called optimistic because it can immediately show the result of performing the action, even though it's actually taking time to complete. So in this example, a newly typed message appears to be submitted while it's actually still sending. The optimistic approach gives the user the impression of speed and responsiveness, and this once the server has finally sent the message, the sending label can be removed. As for use form status hook, we can now provide the status of the last form submission. Additionally, as the example shows, the hook returns information similar to a pending property, which tells the user when the form is actively submitting. As for use action state hook, this allows us to update state based on the result of a form action. So in this example, the state is updated depending on if the item can be added to the cart or not. And last but not least, we have the use hook. The use hook is a React API that reads the value of a resource like a promise or context. This means that the use hook has the ability to change the theme to dark mode no matter how many layers of components there are between the provider using the toggle button, unlike use context, which cannot be called in any conditionals or loops. Meanwhile, the use can, so it's a great use case for it. Here are my works cited for this tech talk. I hope you're able to learn more about how React hooks work and how they can be used to enhance your current and future applications. Please feel free to connect with me for additional conversations on React hooks or any emerging technologies. And once again, I would like to thank Seismic for sponsoring this tech talk. Thank you all for joining me and have a great evening.
Thank you, Garrett, for that very informative tech talk on React hooks. And thank you everyone for coming tonight.